Welcome to the PRAXOLOGie podcast, where theology fuels the mission of the church by helping her to think biblically, reflect theologically, and act missionally. I am Sean Smith with Tyler Patty. And Tyler, why don't you go ahead and give a plug of what this podcast is about and who it's sponsored by?
Oh, yes, indeed. So this podcast is a collaboration between Josiah Venture in Central and Eastern Europe and Formation College. And as you said, we want to help leaders in this part of the world to think theologically, biblically, and act missionally, all the good stuff. And if you've enjoyed the podcast and you want to perhaps learn more about what we are doing and what we can offer leaders in this part of the world, if you're a Central and Eastern European, we'd love to invite you to an open day at Formation College, the European Hub, which will be held on May 9th. So you can email us at on our podcast email if you'd like, praxology@formation.org.uk. Let us know if you're interested in coming. It'll be 2 hours with us and learning more about the program, a little taster, being in the classroom, and getting to meet kind of the wider team. So it'll be a really fun time, hopefully really valuable, and could give you the theology bug. Fair warning.
And on that note, today's episode, we focus on the theology bug by talking about mental health, yours and theirs. Theirs being people in your ministry.
Specifically.
Yours
You're
as
talking
well.
about
Yeah.
my mental health.
Specifically
Okay, cool,
yours,
cool.
Yes. That's actually our focus. That's our intervention session.
Excellent.
Here is just aired for people to listen to. We're going to talk about mental health as an aspect of your knowledge toolkit for success in serving missionally. So I think without further ado, let's get mental. And as a way of doing that for those, we're thinking cognitively using our mind, mental. That's the connection I want to make. So to frame our discussion, actually, this episode kind of relates back to our first episode of the season. It would be a bookend, except for this is not the end of our season here. However, it relates because of the idea of rest, slowing down, and that kind of a thing. But we'll have a turn towards how these things influence mental health, specifically in this little mini-series of the bigger series that we're in. And do so by introducing very carefully an article that Tyler and I have written and are in the midst of seeking publication for. We've submitted it for publication, and because of that, we are not going to give away the punchline. Yeah, or the couple of punchlines, as it were. But we'll walk through the relevant parts of that. The text, Missional Rest, the journal entry, article. We'll call it an article called Missional Rest, and relate that to mental health. So that's where we're going. And I think on the way there, one important note is just how we talk about the word mission. Tyler will take us into the Old Testament because, obviously missional rest relates to being grounded in creation, as does, everything, because Genesis 1 came first in the way that we have the Bible. But a lot of those factors are, how do you want to say, what do you think? Not fully explored in the Genesis account?
Yeah.
Related to doing things and who we are?
Yeah, the connections, I think, haven't been made super strongly, especially in the waters that we swim in related to people who think about ministry and mission and service, which is very heavily focused on action. And so we're always kind of looking to the Bible like, okay, this is our manual for what to do, how to make disciples, how to spread the kingdom. So God, tell me what to do. That we just kind of overlook some really important things related to being.
Yeah, and ironically, you said the waters that we swim in, and then I said missional stream.
Ooh.
So if we're swimming in a stream, one of the things that we should be doing is baptizing people.
Indeed. That is a thing that we should do.
Just fun transition towards this idea of mission. We always connect it with doing. Mm-hmm. And I think the natural inclination for that is okay, because Matthew 28, therefore go That's quite obvious. I mean, try to go somewhere though and leave your soul behind. It doesn't work, but we don't often think that way either. But the specific things that we're commanded to do are, well, indeed, one of them is to baptize, one of them is to teach, and so on. And there's a big influence of doing. And I've already alluded to the fact that part of what we talk about is connecting being to that, and the conceptual level of how we talk about mission, because how we talk impacts what we're doing in local places. Do you want to unpack that and maybe help people understand some of the nuance?
Oh,
Mr. Linguist.
Indeed. How do we do that concisely? I mean, you think about it'd be an interesting exercise. You know, your next talking to our listeners at your next ministry team meeting, to pay attention to the sorts of phrases that keep getting repeated. You know, do people talk a lot about just trusting God? Do people talk a lot about what do we need to do, or what problems do we need to solve? Like those, the phrases that we use and are kind of a part of the cultural package of a ministry team, for example. They impact how that team operates, and so paying attention to those phrases, terms, can help you discern, what might be missing. We're talking a lot about this one thing, but actually we're totally neglecting this other thing. So hopefully we'll bring another phrase, an idea in that you could perhaps introduce to your ministry team. Is that helpful?
I think so. Yeah. How we talk about things is related to what we actually do, but keeping those things separate where we need to is really important. And we actually don't argue this directly in the article, but one thing that because of what I've been reading a lot of recently, it's in my mind and it won't leave, related to the concept of mission. That's we talk about the idea of mission. So if we think mission, not like I'm in the process of doing it right now, but we talk about mission, what is it? And we're actually going to get there next episode as well. As we do that, that's how books are often written as well. Missional theology books are written about the concept of mission, and they make this move towards applying, but they're not, it's more in the conceptual realm. And so what is the conceptual realm of mission focused upon primarily? Doing things, which makes
activity.
Complete sense. But again, if we're in the conceptual level, let's see if we can broaden that out just a bit and say, well, like I said, tongue in cheek, therefore go. Leave your soul behind. Maybe people there are people nowadays who have an issue with the word soul. So leave your spiritual, however you want to say, that's not the physical stuff within you, behind, and go. It's a full stop. It doesn't work. And so that maybe gives a little bit of a wedge that we can prop open the door and allow for ontology in the discussion, I suppose, rather than just purely the concept of doing mission. More like, okay, now I'm moving from the concept to doing. If we're in that, like, how do we do this together? How do we do this idea together? Okay, two things. This idea relates to how our hands and feet move together collectively. And it also relates to what we're doing in the background, because all of that influences our hands and our feet, as it were.
Yeah.
And so part of what we're doing in the article is grounding that in creation. So why don't you walk us through maybe the initial part of that, and then maybe we'll see where we skip over some things in the middle of the article. But grounding it in creation is important. So the creation narrative.
Well, you used a word that probably need to define for our listeners: ontology. What's ontology?
Yes.
Sean? Being.
Who I am.
Yeah. Who are you, Sean?
Existential question.
That's the question. So I'll let you ponder that.
Ontology is talking about who God is.
Yeah.
And well, that can be talked about separately, conceptually, from what God does. But obviously, we're saying they're obviously related.
Yeah. And that's kind of the point that we want to make, is that the doing and the being, they go together. We can separate them to a degree, but like you said, if I'm going out into the world to baptize and teach, I'm not just sending my hands out, not just walking, not just sending my feet.
This isn't the Addams Family.
This is not the Addams Family. Yeah, exactly. But I'm going out as a whole person, and
or thing. Is it thing or it? I don't know what the hand is called. I forget.
Thing. Yeah.
Thing. Yeah.
Nice. We're participating in mission as whole people that are and do. And so how do we understand our own identity and our character formation in the context of mission? So a good place to start is looking at how does God engage with the world. A foundation to kind of missional theology is understanding that God is a God of mission. That's part of who he is and what he does, is that he's a God that reaches out and draws in into his own being. So is that okay for me to say?
It just got me to thinking, if we're speaking that way, what we're not saying is that what God does in mission completely defines who he is. Mm-hmm. But obviously, there's some aspect of who God is that just has that natural outflow.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the natural outflow of who he is mission. Yeah. So Genesis 1, God creates. There's a lot of activity, which can be seen as a kind of an overflow of himself. So he's speaking. His spirit is hovering. He later is shown, getting his hands in the dirt and making this human kind of figure thing, and then breathing his life into it. So there's a lot of God's activity and engagement with his creation, which is really significant. Obviously, if God did not engage in that activity, then this world would not exist and we would not exist. But at the same time, Genesis 1 and 2 paint God not only as a God of activity, but also a God of more than just what he does. He also can step away from his activity. He's not defined just by his busyness, but he, for example, at the end of each day, stops and reflects, and he says, "This is good." And then we get the phrase, and it was evening and morning, the X day. And so there is a time where he actually stops and does not engage in activity, but just enjoys, reflects, rests, not because he's tired, but, and we know that from other parts of Scripture, but because there's something about the pause that makes the activity more meaningful, perhaps, and vice versa. The activity probably makes the pause more meaningful. So there's this rhythm that we see in Genesis 1 in particular of God working and stopping to reflect, to pause. And then at the end of the 7 days, God looks at all that he's made and says it's very good. So there's this great epic reflection, evaluation of all that he's made that's a part of the creation story. And so it's not just the product, but actually enjoying everything as well and reveling in its beauty. And then it says that, here I can read that because that's kind of important. So a lot of people, when they read the Genesis 1 account, they see the creation of humanity as kind of the top moment, the pinnacle. It's very human of us to think that like we're the most important thing in the world, and we are important. It is set aside when we can talk about that later. But actually, if you look at the structure and the flow of the chapter, the pinnacle is the seventh day. After 6 days of activity, this rhythm of activity and rest, the seventh day is.
I'm just going to restate what you've just said, because I think that it's such a simple thing, it can get lost. And what you've just said, what we're kind of arguing in the article, is that humanity is not the point of direct focus, in a sense. Mm-hmm. That actually the point of direct focus is the relationship of the days culminating with what goes on the seventh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We don't. That's a totally different way of reading the text. So maybe we would invite you watching on YouTube, those listening, if you're able to, crack open your Bible and read with those. Maybe read it twice, with once thinking through humanity as the point, and the other one, read it. We're not saying it's not humanity's not the point again, but read it as if the seventh day is the culmination, and just see if you can get a sense of the flavor of how it's different.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great tip. So one of the reasons that people might struggle with this sort of reading is because of the way that those first two chapters are actually divided, which chapter divisions are not original to the text. So that somebody in like the 14th century was like, this is really hard to read. Let's stick some numbers in there and so we can break it up. And so they actually stuck it in and stuck the chapter 2 beginning before chapter 1 is really finished. So that's where it gets a little tricky. So
people do think this is 2 separate accounts and get stuck there.
Yeah, exactly. But so, and it does shift in verse 4, but verses 1 and 3 of chapter 2 still belong to the first chapter. So, and this is where it gets really important. So
how do you know?
Because of the structure and the rhythm. So it goes day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7 before it shifts to something else. So is
the beginning of days, or the finishing of 7 is in chapter 2.
The finishing of 7 is in chapter 2, and I'll just read this because it's really important. So think of this in our argument now as the pinnacle of everything that's happened. So the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed. On the seventh day, God had completed his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, for on it he rested from all his work of creation. So seventh day is this mega awesome epic day because that's the only day that is blessed. God said everything else was good and all of creation is very good, but this special day is set aside and blessed. And the words that are kind of echoed back and forth are completed. So everything is finished. And that's the reason for the rest. And also it's finished because God rested. Because he worked, because he did all that work before. And so those are the kind of two things that keep repeating. And it's interesting to speculate a little bit. There's a textual thing here. Some translations say that by the seventh day, God had completed everything. So so it took him 6 days and then he was like, I've got an extra day. So might as well relax. But there are textual reasons to actually read it like the CSB, the Christian Standard Bible that I'm reading, puts it. On the seventh day, God had completed his work. So the Sabbath is a part of creation. And that's where it is kind of this capstone, this final piece that gives meaning to the whole. And that Sabbath is a epic ultra rest and reflection, not just a portion of the day, but it actually it takes up the whole day, and that's very meaningful. Yes. What do you want to pull out of that?
Just again to highlight the point of this subtle move is that that's probably a preposition in Hebrew or something similar. By versus on. That's what it would, yeah. My Hebrew is so bad at this point, but that's how it would be in Greek, and languages are kind of similar-ish. On the seventh day, God finished. So it's a small maneuver to say it's not 6 days of creation, and we think of it that way. Mm-hmm. And then the rest becomes this separate piece, but rather all 7 and the rest then is included, which creates the idea of what we're saying is that God creates this rhythmic nature of work and then rest, and that there's different ways that we could, I think, how the rest works that we'll just leave off and say surprise in the article. Surprise. But I think we've really focused there before as well of how we participate in what God's doing,
right?
And so our mission does include rest.
Yeah, and that's a point that we can make is that if a key part of Genesis 1 is that we as humanity are created in God's image, and so we ought to reflect Him. We were created to reflect Him, and not just in our activity, not just in the things that we do for God, but also in the rhythms that we have in place in our lives that allow us to rest and reflect both rhythmically, like on an ongoing basis, and also deeply. and that makes for a more meaningful life, I would say. And a big takeaway for me is thinking about rest not as something that I do so that I can get back to work, which is often how we think about it. Okay, I gotta sleep and take my day off so that I kind of fill my tank and I can go back to doing things, because that's what God is really happy about. But thinking, no, actually, if God delights in rest and reflection, then I can as well, and that can be part of me reflecting God to the world. I was meeting with a local elder recently, and he was saying, oh, I'm so burdened and just feel really rushed and stressed these days. And I've been thinking that, what does that do for my witness when everybody around me is also stressed and burdened and hurried, but I'm no better, and so I encouraged him that, like, we do have something better, that God's rhythms do offer an antidote to the hurry, to the busyness, to the exhaustion, that we can actually tap into for missional purposes. That can be a great witness if we are people who are both active and are able to rest and be more whole people.
Yeah, and I think if we can get to the level, once more, of the conceptual versus the actual in doing this and seeing rest as a vital act of participating in God, then there are two things to think about. One is, am I practicing the Sabbath? And the actual point of that, not just, well, I'm supposed to because then it increases my work and so on. That's shortchanging the actual point. I actively work myself that way and have to remind myself I have so much to do. I really, this week, happened yesterday. What is this? Today's Monday. And over the weekend, Saturday, my day off, always my day off, I'm thinking, I've got a major deadline coming up. Yes. I need to, maybe I'll just little periods of time here. And I thought, no, that's not what we've been called to do, in my opinion. I'm not saying that that's always the case, whatever. I'm not making a definitive point. But practicing that is important so that we're not overworking and overburdening ourselves, because that's not how God intended it, is partly what we're saying. Now, part of that also is the conceptual level of that. I'm practicing this, but how do other people know that? What do other people perceive of my resting?
Yes.
And so there are mechanisms that maybe we can end here and then go into the lightning round and then move forward with some of the practical output, unless you have some other things to say in the Old Testament piece.
We're good.
There are some other things that would be really important.
There's lots more.
but I don't think we should. So there's like three things, that we're hiding from you on purpose. So hopefully that article will get published. Pray for that. If we're thinking about how other people look at us in our rest and our work, it's just a fact. Some people think, wow, that person never stops.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's an assumption because they see the output of what a person is doing. Now, there are different kinds of people. Some people just churn stuff out, and it doesn't necessitate that they never stop. It just means that they're able to really, really focus. I oftentimes wonder if I get placed in that category myself, but I have this incredible capacity to sit at my desk for 10 hours without getting up almost, and I can just get stuff done when I need to.
Yes, you can.
But I'm very motivated and have a very strong sense of what I'm doing is directly in my calling, as it were. Mm-hmm. So that's always connected. And I wonder if some people think, wow, man, and then there's this weird comparison aspect that happens. And when we talk mental health, we can't compare ourselves with other people, especially if we're making it on an assumption that's not right.
Yes.
So maybe we should just stop and maybe just ask people questions instead of making assumptions, maybe is what I'm really trying to say. But we can't look at other people's output and assume that they never rest. Mm-hmm. And as an aspect of that for me, to protect it so that others will, not so that others will see what I'm doing. That's not the point. But so that others know that I have boundaries, as it were.
Yeah.
I don't ever respond to students or other staff anymore, really, at this point, on Friday evening or Saturday. Occasionally on Sunday afternoon, I'll do some things moving forward. But Friday evening through Sunday after church, I'd never respond to students or staff. And typically past 5 or 5:30, Monday through Friday, I don't respond unless it's some extraordinary thing and planned with my wife, family involved, and so on. That there's a specific time. I'm not responding to people past, a typical work hour. For me, that works. Yes. We're weird missionaries.
Yes.
So we do things like in the evenings on occasion and so forth. Those things are accounted. So maybe not everybody has a strict 8 to 5 rhythm, but a way of guarding that is just not responding and just waiting until the next day when things open up again and so forth.
Absolutely.
Any comment that you want to have there? No?
That's good.
Okay. Let's, I hijacked myself, go into the lightning round. And instead of asking each other questions, I've got this joke, I suppose, that I'm going to read to Tyler. And this lightning round will be his response.
My response. Oh, no.
I'm guessing that a lot of you have heard this before. I'm currently on Reddit, I believe, because this is where it's at. But anyway, it's very funny to me. A Calvinist. All right. Tyler's already.
I know where this is going.
Anglicanisms don't. We don't Calvin. Who's that guy? Institutes. He wrote those. A Calvinist arrives at the gates of heaven. He sees that there are 2 lines going in. One has a sign that reads predestined, and the other free will. He naturally heads to the predestined line. While he's waiting, an angel comes and asks him, "Why are you in this line?" He replies, "Because I chose it." The angel looks surprised. "Well, if you chose it, then you should be in the free will line." So our Calvinist, now slightly miffed, obediently wanders over to the free will line, thinking, "I should have been an Arminian all along."
Oh.
Again, after a few minutes, another angel asks him, "Why are you in this line?" He sullenly replies, "Someone made me come here." So there's a joke on both sides of the Calvinist-Arminian debate there. What's your response?
That's good. That's very funny. I have heard this before, so it's not quite a genuine reaction, but I do find it very humorous, and it reminds me of the late nights in college debating whether Calvinism or Arminianism was correct, which was a fruitless debate. Fun times, though.
Today's lightning round brought to you by let's talk about things more important than what seems like it's really important. There's a lot of really nuanced issues related to predestination and so forth. One of which we actually, moving back to Genesis 1, could tease out a bit. And by no means have we given away our position of Calvinism or Arminianism. I took a wonderful class from Scott Manage. He's at least within America, one of the top scholars for Calvin. And it was a wonderful course. And I disagree with a lot of what Calvin did. But at the same time, there's a lot to learn.
Yes.
He wrote the entire Institutes with the lens of the Christian life in mind, which doesn't come across because he writes a predestination. He gets really in the weeds. He starts attacking other people, but he really looks at it through the lens of the Christian life. And so there's a beauty in that. And I'm not as into Luther, so I don't know. He probably did as well.
He probably did as well.
But if we think about in creation, God's predestination of these things and so forth, does he determine absolutely everything, blah, blah, blah? How do we account for the fact that God is outside of time? In fact, you said a phrase earlier in creation that God was busy doing creating. If God is outside of time, he's in creation, he's creating things on the timeline. I'm on the timeline. I'm thinking Loki because whatever. But he's inputting, but he's not in the timeline directly. So he's atemporal. And so does that mean that when God was creating, he was busy? Who knows? That's very philosophical. We'll set that aside. But the point is then, how does God, who's outside of time, relate to things inside of time? One of those views is that he predestined everything, and another is he's outside of time. Therefore, of course, he knows everything, but it's not in a causally determined way. He's able to experience everything as if for him it's right now. So some people call that the eternal now, and so on. And so this really complicates a lot of that stuff. But if we only talk about Calvin and Arminian in that debate, like along those traditional lines, we never get to the real
Never
point.
get to the fun stuff.
And I just hinted at, like one thing.
Oh, yeah.
That confuses the nature of it. Anyway, that relates to this idea of missional rest grounded in Genesis and creation. Let's move it forward then and talk about our conclusions and relate that to more directly. I think we've had some snippets here throughout, but directly to mental health.
Yep.
And specifically yours, like literally your own, Tyler.
Oh.
And also other leaders. Plus, think about theirs, the people in our ministries.
Absolutely.
How do we conceptually model that and also think about it for ourselves? Now, I think we can share the high level points.
Yeah, I agree.
And there's two, so I'll mention them. And then if you want to go into discussion, you can. Considering the measurement of fruit in mission. That's a loaded statement. The second thing, fostering longevity in ministry. That's more of a given. But maybe tease out this. It's a very short paragraph. This is a journal article. Much more could be said, and we'll say it now maybe. But take us into what are we talking about, Tyler, when we say considering the measurement of fruit in mission?
So often, probably indebted to Western kind of business influences. Numeric growth drives a lot of missional strategies. How can we make things grow, right? How can we make our churches grow? How can we grow our team? We never have enough people, but we need to get more people. We need to reach more people.
That's easy. You just follow Donald McGavran and the homogeneous unit principle and plant churches along lines of people who look like each other.
There you
and
go.
Ignore a lot of other parts of Scripture at the same time.
There was a little random bomb dropped in the middle of the podcast.
Donald McGavran is important in the discussion, and he's in a sense part of the issue. He's not completely wrong. It's just incomplete. I'll say it that way.
Yeah. So
because of the numeric thing.
Yeah. So some things. So we're not saying the numeric growth is not important to consider, because Acts is a good model for us for some pretty amazing numeric growth.
And also there are lists, internal lists that are noted in Scripture that are kept of people like widows and so forth.
Yeah.
So there's no value at all. Yeah.
But we do want to consider like widening our scope of how we measure fruitfulness, because a lot of, I guess this goes into the next point as well. But if we're only driven by growth and movement and like progress, then when things stagnate or go backwards, then what do we do with that? Is that our fault? Did we do something wrong? Should we just abandon the whole project? And by widening, our conception of mission to include elements of rest and character growth and rhythms, then we can start paying attention when we think about fruitfulness to other things too, like how are disciples and leaders being transformed? What growth do we see on the character level? What fruit of the Spirit is exhibited in their lives? How faithful are people? Like, that's one of the things that if you look back at the history of mission in the church, a lot of times the biggest growth happened just through like steady, slow faithfulness. And so this is a move that is even happening in the business world as well. One of our colleagues at Josiah Venture just sent a message to some leaders the other day. Did you see that?
I was thinking of this book also. Yeah.
So it's a new book by Cal Newport called Slow Productivity. And this is the same person who wrote the book Deep Work, right?
Yep.
So it's kind of reframing productivity to not just be about your output and how much and how fast how you can produce, but how are you considering productivity over a longer period of time and integrating kind of rhythms and even slowness in the trajectory of getting things accomplished. So those are some ideas for the measurement of fruit in mission. So kind of widening our things our list of things that we pay attention to, and we evaluate whether a ministry has been successful or not.
Fun little exercise. Do you consider fruit Sabbath? We typically think of fruit as in, I planted, I messed the order up. Apollos watered, Paul planted, Apollos watered, God caused the growth. We think of typical things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And we exclude Sabbath. So if we include Sabbath as a fruit, a question that we could ask of ourselves related to our own mental health, especially in Central and Eastern European ministry being overworked and overburdened because there's not enough people and so on.
Yep.
And a lot of need. And so there's two options, I suppose, is I'll rest when I'm dead, which is a typical college. Well, my wife had that motto when she was in college and has since she doesn't do that anymore. And if we don't, go ahead.
I have another quip that I heard. So people often say, like, evil doesn't rest, so neither should I. Yeah. But somebody wrote recently, I read, well, if evil doesn't rest, then I don't want to be like evil, so I'm going to rest.
Mm-hmm. Well, be like good. God rested.
There you go. Exactly. Done. Solved.
Genesis 1. Okay. I mean, yeah. But a real measure is when you're looking at, people tend to do this in either annual or quarterly types of rhythms and go, okay, this is where our team is, this is where we're heading, and my own personal goals related to all that. And there's a looking back and a looking forward. And when we're kind of looking back on the previous season and saying what evidence is there of fruit of our goals and fruit within me that God is doing things. And I think we should consider one of those to be, am I resting?
Yes, absolutely.
It's a weird kind of a fruit, but, and maybe I'll just not even tease this out, but if you look at the fruit of the Spirit, if all you do is do that, it backfires. Dernier, a Hungarian psychologist and theologian, talks about this. If you only focus on love, you're going to love somebody to death. Like literally, they're going to get so mad, they're going to like punch you. Like, just stop and give me some space. Well, if all you're doing is focused on love and being really joyful all the time and so forth, then there's a lot of other aspects that are being missed. So even there, where it's not just, the measurement shouldn't just be, am I doing that? But that's the composite character of God, according to me. If we're measuring against that, then that widens the category for saying minimally, am I doing love well? Am I joyful rightly, like in a real way, not a false, shallow, everything's happy kind of a thing, and so on. Yeah,
absolutely.
You
want to talk about our next point?
Fostering longevity in ministry. This is in many ways, we're making the statement that our Christian doing must flow from an outpouring of our being. And that may actually be a philosophical overstatement because of the connection that we're trying to make, come to think of it. But you've got to, again, this is the conceptual level we're talking, and the actual practice level is more connected than that. But we're trying to emphasize through that, if you hear anything, that the aspects of being need to be focused on and not just doing things to the neglect of my own self. Like 8 hours of sleep a night, 7 to 8, 9, whatever it is a healthy thing. That's related to who I am and how I'm treating myself. So that, also could be related to measuring fruit. But if we're doing those things and measuring them, then we're focused on the right things, because it goes away from a myopic or very short-term view of ministry to the long-term view that God appears to take. And we're participating in the long-term view by sometimes saying no, or not right now, or better yet, is there somebody else who I can very quickly equip to go do this? Or maybe we think forward and there are other people that we need to, kind of train up and lead to, so that we can all do this in a healthy and God-honoring way.
Yeah.
I think.
Absolutely. Well said.
In wrapping it up then, how do we summarize? Essentially, that mission, the modern, talking about the modern concept in theology, mission brackets out rest. We're saying, no, it's included. And so we're, even within that, the barometers, the measures of ministry become different. A lot of them the same, some of them different. How do we, I think fostering longevity in ministry, cultivating fruit, there's still a focus there on personal leaders' mental health. But maybe we just tease out very quickly people in your ministry.
Yeah.
And modeling that for them by talking and so on. I think that a lot of people just aren't aware of these aspects. Do you think that's fair? Like, people in ministry they're not thinking like, do I ever slow down? Are they only thinking I have to do more? Probably not. But
yeah, I don't know. That'd be something for our listeners to self-reflect on right now. Practice a little missional rest and reflect now. Do you value your own slowing down? Is that an important part of how you think through your week? Certainly, I think it's a temptation for those of us who are in ministry to kind of be proud of the fact that we're busy, or that, like, there's no time. And we kind of use it as especially, we can feel that way if we feel pressure to prove something to either our employer or the church or our ministry partners, like, I'm doing stuff, like, you entrusted with this to me, and so here I'm going to prove to you that I'm laying my life down, laying it all out. That's kind of our badge of honor, but that might not be the only badge of honor you want to wear. You might want to be busy and honoring in how you use your time, but also be, guard, like you said, guard your time of rest, guard your time of reflection, and maybe talk about that as well and help people see that. I think that's been helpful for you as well, in maybe some people perceiving that you do overwork, you then saying, oh, I think I'm resting well, but maybe I'm not talking about it. And so let me talk about it. Let me reflect on, how was my weekend? How did I rest? What did we, how did I slow down?
Like I did earlier.
You did earlier, even on the podcast. So, so wearing rest as a badge of honor feels selfish sometimes, but it's actually really important.
There's an aspect of like a weird sort of, be more guilt probably than shame, overlap of the two. Yeah. That oftentimes I think is a shallow thing that people go, that's not good. So then we just do more. But again, if the seventh day is the seventh day and rest is part of all of it, the pressure's off. Quite literally. Now, let me just introduce the idea then of, if this is true, but people in our ministries don't know it, then they're probably confused about what it means to find rest by taking on the light burden of Jesus' yoke and entering God's rest that the book of Hebrews talks about. And related to mental health specifically, especially nowadays with Gen Z and Gen A coming up, anxiety is not under the surface anymore. I think with millennials, our parents' generation appears to, I'm not giving an indictment, appears to have that under the surface, but never talk about it. And it's just do more, and that's just what you got to do. With millennials and moving forward, it's like, no, it's health is a thing. And so anxiety is talked about more and more and more. And now it's technology, all this other stuff we've talked about. So I think introducing this idea from counseling called triangulation of care. And that is a key thing. I'll take from Stephen Grego. He has a book with a yellow front cover called Trekking Toward Wholeness. It's sort of like his model, part of his model for counseling. He was at Trinity for a long time. When both of us were there, I took a class with him. Brilliant. I loved all my counseling stuff at Trinity, multiple classes. His book just really directly relates here, and he talks about what a triangulation of care is from a ministry leader's perspective. There are things like clinical anxiety that you need to talk about with somebody who knows what they're doing, because there's a lot of nuance to that. Could be depression, and even within that, there are multiple categories. Could be the opposite, and so on. So the triangulation of care, I mean, we think triangle, with putting the person in relationship. Yeah, exactly, like this piece of art here that Tyler's holding up, a little,
like a pyramid.
A pyramid, yeah, I couldn't think of the word. A three-dimensional pyramid. A triangulation of care would be a ministry professional, like a pastor, and say a licensed clinical professional, somebody who's a psychologist or a counselor, if and when that's necessary, and then also somebody local, somebody important to a person. So it could be like a family friend, it could be a close friend, a coworker, and so on. And the idea is that if you're going to trek toward wholeness, you have to include all three. I think most people's inclination is just to go to the
professional,
the clinical professional, evidenced by the fact that, at least in the Czech Republic, there's like nobody focused at the pastoral level on how you do some, I'll say first aid, I suppose. But if you're working with people in ministry, then some of this stuff's really helpful. Knowing when and where to help. A counselor can help in a very specific way with the underlying anxiety over time to help a person become more integrated and attuned and so forth. But there are aspects of how that relates to faith that a person needs a ministry professional for. And part of that's where I want to come in. So maybe you're a friend of somebody, or you're a leader in a ministry. If we enter what's this called again? The
pyramid.
The pyramid from that vantage point of the friend or the ministry professional. Then there's an easy way of saying, of being able to differentiate what we can talk about and what we can't. It's like, well, maybe sometimes it's appropriate to ask, are you meeting with somebody? Do you have a counselor? Like, that's a good thing to do, and find out, and then leave this stuff and create that triangulation of care if somebody doesn't have one, maybe. But then focus on the issues that are appropriate. The other things are all related, but talking about this idea of like burnout, is that a thing? Are you working too much? How does this relate to how you're thinking about your Christian practice? And then we are all of a sudden in this realm of rest, slowing down, thinking about productivity in different ways, like Newport and so forth.
That's right. Yeah. That's a great encouragement. And there, you mentioned there's not a whole lot on like first aid, mental health stuff. Josiah Ventures tried to fix that a little bit by hosting a conference in last September. If you go to josiahventure.com, click on media, you can access some great teaching on kind of first aid for youth workers. It's in English, very accessible. Jirka Jedlička, who's on our Czech team, also does training with teams of leaders all over the Czech Republic to try and get them up on this, because there's a lack of professionals and people need it. But there is a lot that we can do, even not having that training. And so it doesn't mean we have to, when we step into that, what you're saying is we don't have to do everything, but we can take our part and do a good job of caring and making sure that they have other people that they're also talking to.
Yeah, I mean, we take the theological focus.
Mm-hmm.
How does it relate to Christian ministry and practice? That seems to be obvious. If we're not licensed, then we shouldn't talk to certain things. That's what somebody else is for.
Yep.
But seeing the connection points of how that triangle helps a person become whole is really important, I think, which requires a great deal of personal integration of a person to be able to help other people in that way. So mental health, yours and theirs, yeah, it's related.
It is
how
related.
you help others is related to yours.
Yeah.
This idea of self-care, I think, is really popular at the popular level. I'll just leave it at that. Let's pause it there. And in some ways, we'll pick up this conversation next time by talking about sort of this idea of mission. Like, what actually is mission? What is service? Where should we burden ourselves for real? And where should we just stop and do things, whatever, that are helpful, and talk more at that level. So we're kind of moving out of some of the mental health stuff. But if you have further questions for us on anything we've said related to mental health and serving missionally, praxology at formission.org.uk, or of course on social media. Our wonderful teammate Killian Spies will get with you and see that pretty quickly, pass it along to us. And we'd love to be in conversation as we speak about triangulation of care in community with each other. But until next time, we say, go in peace.
See you next time.